This episode is sponsored by me and Learn Light and Sound. We have courses on how to improve your lighting and sound, linked down below. Now, before we jump in, this is a new stereo shotgun microphone from Sennheiser. They announced it just before NAB about 6 weeks ago or so. We're recording indoors, and you might be asking yourself, Curtis, this is a stereo shotgun microphone. Why wouldn't you do this outdoors? I would love to do that. Unfortunately, none of my windscreens can accommodate the cable that I have that comes out of the microphone. So rather than a regular 3-pin XLR, because it's a stereo microphone, it has a 5-pin XLR output. So I had to buy an adapter cable. I wasn't able to find one that works with all my windshields, so at least I have one so I can test it and give you some samples here. But we'll have to come back to when I can actually go outside and do, I think, really what this microphone was designed to do primarily. But what's unique about this microphone? First of all, it's a stereo shotgun microphone that has 3 different modes. There is a mid-side stereo mode, an XY wide mode, and an XY narrow mode. This is pretty cool because it gives you some flexibility. What that means, in the mid-side mode, you could actually use this as a standard shotgun microphone. So it's just for capturing dialogue, for example. You just take the mid microphone feed, just hook up one of the XLR outputs, and you've got a great dialogue shotgun microphone. Then if you want to capture some ambient sound, then you can do that in one of those 3 different stereo modes. Now, we have a separate video where we talk about what mid-side stereo recording is and what mid-side stereo audio is in general. I'll put a link for that down below as well, so you can go and figure out what that is. XY, wide and narrow, either pick up a narrower or a wider stereo image. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, sometimes you want it to be a little bit more narrow, sometimes you want something that's a little bit more immersive and wider, depending on what you're trying to achieve. This does all of that for you. So literally what you're recording to your recorder on 2 separate tracks is the left and the right stereo tracks, and you don't have to do any special processing in post. With mid-side, you either need to use mid-side decoding on your recorder or you need to do that in post-production. And again, that's covered in our other video. Why am I excited about this microphone? I'm excited about it because it's a Sennheiser microphone. First of all, I've always had a great experience with all of the quality. It's certainly the MKH series of microphones, and with the 8000 series, which is this is a part of. All those microphones have been great. And I don't have any good stereo microphones yet. I have 2 separate microphones I can use to record stereo imagery, but this is the first one. It's all built into one. So what's unique about it? Let's run through the features really quickly. Switchable low-cut filter at -3 dB at 70 hertz. So it has a very different kind of high-pass / low-cut filter versus some other microphones that came out of Sennheiser's design house. For example, the MKH 50 is a much more extreme. It cuts much farther up the spectrum, which is good if you're using the microphone up close to manage all of the proximity effect that you might get. But this one's a little bit more, I think, ideal for dialogue capture and for most general purposes. There's a -10 dB pad, so if you're going to be recording something a little bit louder, we'll come back to that in a little bit. Compact design, so it's basically about the same size in terms of length as the MKH 416, so I would say it's a medium shotgun microphone. Larger diameter in this case. Of course, what's good about this as well is if you're going to be using other Sennheiser microphones, this should cut very nicely between them. They've created a sound signature that's very similar to their other microphones. Let's get you some samples. So, oh, by the way, this entire thing is recorded with the MKH 8018. It's boomed up above me and actually quite a bit farther than typical. I found that if you move this microphone in close, there is some proximity effect. So this is actually a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. I think it's a good thing. I can move the microphone farther away and it still holds onto the bass a lot better. Here's a sample. We're back on mid-side mode, and I want to demonstrate how this does with bass pickup at different distances, because it actually holds onto it quite well. Hear the creaking of the table. Here I am about 12 inches from the microphone. You can hear a lot more bass, proximity effect. Maybe about 2 feet from the microphone. Maybe about 3 feet from the microphone, roughly. Getting a little farther here. And here, we are probably about 6 feet from the microphone total, so 2 yards for those that reckon in the good old, maybe not so good imperial. And then coming back up closer, for meters. Meters are roughly a yard. Not exactly, but... Now, just like all of the Sennheiser MKH series microphones, this is an RF bias microphone as well, which means that it's going to be a bit more reliable when it comes to extraordinarily humid environments and or hot or cold. They tend to hold up better and you get less crackling and other weird artifacts when working in those conditions, so that's really nice as well. Self-noise is pretty much in line with a lot of other shotgun microphones. It is, we'll put the specs up on the screen here, but it's pretty normal. It's not going to win the prize for the world's lowest self-noise of all microphones. I think Rode still holds that one on their NT1 large diaphragm condenser, but in any case, it's clean enough in my mind for production use, absolutely. All right, the mic comes with the mic itself, of course, a stand clamp, a foam windshield, a threaded transport tube, which is just a little plastic tube that you can put it in, and an adapter ring. So you can attach it to either 3/8 or 5/8 microphone stands. It's priced at $1,999 US at the time of this review. It's not a microphone for those that are working on a very tight budget. You're going to need to have a little bit more budget. But the nice thing is if you're getting started in production sound, this is one microphone that can do a lot of things. It can be your primary boom microphone for dialogue capture, but it can also capture ambiance as well. So in some regards, it is pretty efficient. So important to keep that in mind. All right, let me give you some of my thoughts. Actually, before we do my thoughts, let's get you some samples. First, we're going to get you a mid-side sample with the 8018. Then we're going to get you a mid-side sample using the MKH 8050 and 8030, two separate microphones, just to see how it compares. Common setup for mid-side recording. Then we'll give you the XY narrow sample, XY wide, and then we'll also play a sample from the Sennheiser MKH 416 so you can hear how it compares to that in terms of sound signature. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. Whoa, focus. Get back on me. There we go. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Oh, come on, camera. I'm right here. Hello. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Some things to consider on this microphone that are a little bit different than a lot of other XLR-based microphones. You will need a 5-pin female to dual 3-pin male XLR adapter cable. And you'll also want to make sure that that's compatible with whatever shock mount and or windshield that you're using. And that's why I'm not recording outdoors, is the only cable I was able to source fairly quickly, because I knew people would be interested in this microphone, is one from Remote Audio, and it does not fit into any of my windshields, unfortunately, but we're working through that. I'll find something there and probably follow up on that. Here are some questions I received. Does it have the same or less self-noise as the Sennheiser MKH 8030, 8050 mid-side combination? And I guess the thinking behind that is that they could trade those for a single 8018. I would say they're nearly identical in terms of self-noise, with the 8018 side mic being within 1.5 dB A-weighted equivalent input noise to the MKH 8030. Otherwise, they're pretty much identical. So I think the question should be less about noise and more about, are you getting the same imaging from this? And you can listen to those samples to determine that for yourself. Another question, why are you interested in this mic? And my answer is, why not? I'd like to do more sound design, and this is a really good, convenient way to do that for recording both ambience on dialogue and sound effects that you want isolated. Probably the main downside I can think of for this mic, and it's not a downside for everybody, for some people, if you record very loud sounds, firearms, really loud engines, whether that be aircraft or cars, explosions, this may not be able to do that. So its max sound pressure level specification is 126 dB SPL. So that's important to keep in mind. I would say this mic is really designed for capturing ambiance of nature, wildlife, maybe sporting events, and it doubles as a great dialogue capture shotgun microphone as well if you just use the mid mic and mid-side mode. I think what's really nice about it, it holds bass well. So if you do a lot of wide shots, that's a wonderful thing about a lot of the Sennheiser MKH series microphones is that they hold on to bass even when you move farther back. That's something that a lot of other microphones don't do. It's very versatile. It has that 70 hertz high pass. It has a minus 10 dB pad if that's important to you as well. It cuts, I think, reasonably well with the other Sennheiser 8000 series microphones. You won't have to do a massive amount of EQ matching. It does also have this non-reflective paint called they call Nextel, so you won't mess with lighting designs and reflections and things like that. So overall, that's where I'm at with this microphone. My overall sentiment is I love it. It's not for everybody, but for those that need a dialogue shotgun microphone and want to be able to record stereo ambiance, will not be recording extraordinarily loud sound sources, this could be a really, really good option. So hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. Get out there and make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again soon.